Hi, thank you, Sheena and Rita, for inviting me to talk about this. I love a good rubric. And for those of you who don't know, my name's Cotter Christian, and I'm the Dean of the School of Constructed Environments at Parsons. More recently, I had a role that Jennifer Rittner now shares, which is as Associate Dean of Curriculum and Learning for Parsons. But my experience with rubrics goes way back. In fact, I remember being part-time faculty 15, 17 years ago down in Atlanta and being exposed to rubrics for the first time and being so frustrated with my experience using them. And so it made it my mission to try and find a system that works, and still haven't necessarily found that system. But this is an attempt at kind of thinking how to streamline things using AI. So I'm also glad to hear, Sheena, that you're going to be talking about using Canvas, because that actually was one of the ways I started to incorporate AI as a tool to help make that work faster. And I just want to be clear on a couple of things. Again, I'm speaking off the cuff here, and I have a kind of rough outline of how to go through these things, but given the informal nature of these conversations, like at any point, just raise the digital hand and we can stop and talk about whatever's useful. Um, One, I'm not going to talk about the ethics of AI because that's just a whole different conversation. And I know there's environmental concerns. I know that there's ethical concerns. I find that when I input information, that's my own information, and I'm able to kind of use it as a tool to manipulate and ask questions about my own information, I tend to put it tends to put some guardrails on the responses that you get that's useful. The other thing is I don't use AI to grade students' work. That's the other piece that I think is important. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, like many of us, I do have Grammarly installed on my computer, and it does make suggestions about improved grammar, which is a form of AI as well. And so I will oftentimes use that if I'm trying to make sure I sound as eloquent as I can, although inserting some mistakes are always good as well. So as far as rubrics in general, um, I think the folks here, from what I know, are people who are all kind of actively involved in curriculum and learning and know the value of these as tools. But I do feel like it's inconsistent across all of our courses and programs. But students perform better when they're provided with clear expectations. So when they know what they are sort of expected to deliver in terms of conceptual ideas, they have a better understanding of what they're looking to do. Rubrics also give us a chance to have consistent grading and feedback, so that you're, able to judge students equally and fairly. And we also know what we're teaching, whether or not it's working. So rubrics give us a really early signal as to if students are underperforming in a certain criteria on an assignment, and everyone did, then we know that maybe something we're doing isn't working and we need to go back and revisit that. But most importantly, it shows us not only where we can improve, but also where students can improve. And in this current culture of assessment, rubrics are also really great to get a larger picture across multiple classes, multiple students, and multiple programs. When we're making an effective rubric, I think having really clear descriptions is important. And so I have a little, let me see if I'll drop the link in the chat. This is what I asked ChatGPT to give me a poorly designed rubric, and this is what it came up with. So this is an example of what it's calling a poorly designed rubric. And you'll notice that it's about, I guess, about a writing assignment. It has some sort of criteria on the left and gives us really vague and, sort of unclear subjective categories for what things means, like how do you differentiate between good effort and some effort. And so this is the type of rubric that we want to avoid, because as a student, there's too much subjectivity here and not enough clarity, and also leads to sort of inconsistent grading. There's not really anything actionable that students can do with a rubric like this. They're not able to take this and say, oh, that's where I need to improve. But maybe it's a good start because at least there's some framework there to start through organizing. So I asked again to say, let's take that same rubric and improve it. What would it look like to improve? a rubric like that. And this is what I came up with, or in collaboration with my AI tool came up with, which is a rubric that I'm calling a more well-designed rubric. And so you'll notice that in this one, I didn't change anything from what the output was. And I'm not advocating, again, this is an example of sort of a more fleshed out criteria for each, or category for each one of those criteria. But just goes to show that when you have some more detail, you're able to kind of identify specific areas for improvement, and get a better sense of what that might look like. These kind of look like what the Canvas rubric format looks like as well, which it asks for a lot of information for each one of the levels, which can get time consuming because you're sort of saying the same thing, but in different ways, using a Bloom's taxonomy-ish language to identify what those different levels are. All right, so as far as that was just kind of a fun exercise that I did to see what ChatGPT thought was a good and a bad rubric, and it does sort of align with general good practices around a rubric. I did want to just, I'll share my screen for just a second. Of course, once I log in and do the Duolingo thing. Okay, we're good. Let's see. Where am I? Okay, so this is one of the assignments that I think I'll kind of be referencing a little bit. I teach interior design studios often. We do all sorts of exercises that have really detailed project briefs and deliverables associated with them. This particular module that was in a studio I taught, I guess not last fall, but the prior fall, was a competition. And so it had really strict criteria and outlines based on the folks who were writing the competition brief. And so this is the, basically what students were expected to do. It's very straightforward, but of course, it's a design project. And so there is some subjectivity in terms of how students pursue that work. I just wanted to show you the rubric that was produced for Canvas and kind of how those things differentiate. We're not going to maybe have time to get too much into the Canvas rubric making process, which is a little icky in my personal opinion. I understand the value of Canvas and why it's a good tool as a LMS, but in terms of the setup, it's not as flexible as what I would like. And one of the things I just wanted to point out here is one, I mean, it goes without saying, as a designer, I can't stand that like these lines don't line up, right? There's things like that we could just off the board say need a little love. Actually, Eugene and I were talking about that yesterday, just how educational software gets so little attention from, the tech industry, can use a lot of improvement. But I think one of the things that I find most challenging is like this range, right? If I want to give more weight to one category, I have to end up with all these weird points, 21, 18, right? And it automatically will give you those points when you start using these tools. But they're just kind of gross to me because it's hard as a student to say what's the difference between 21 points and 18 points. They're so close, but not, obviously there's some language here that helps to explain that, but just on the surface, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And so one of the things I often try to do is produce rubrics that I will share my screen again with this one. Hang on just a second. Okay. So what I really have always wanted to do is to use weighted criteria, and also have levels that are really easy. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And the weighting allows you then to take the level and extrapolate a weighted score in Excel or in Google Sheets. So it's similar to what you might see with the Canvas rubric, in that it allows you these different categories and you can explain what each level of achievement means. And then you can give it a weight, and through the magic of different equations, you can get those weighted scores and eventually get the average score based on the weights and then assign it a grade. So for me, this is a lot more as a student, when I see a 5 or a 4 or 3, it makes a lot more sense than an 18, a 22, and a 21, right? So like just having a kind of more clear rubric. Now, one of the things I'll say is that all of these equations, I just asked ChatGPT to make those for me. So I said, I'm using Google Sheets for a rubric. I need to get, a weighted average for each thing. Just tell me what the equation is for that. So that was, if you're not comfortable with using some of these tools or, creating equations, it's really good for stuff like that. So if you ever need like equations for your Google Sheets or for your Excel, it's a good place to go for that. So I know it's kind of rambling so far, but I do have some examples of actually using AI to create rubrics and to identify learning outcomes and learning objectives for assignments. So let me see. I kind of wrote, this is the thing that I've found in going through this week and trying to come up with things to show you and things to talk about is I found that my relationship with the LLM, the ChatGPT interface is very fluid. It isn't like a straightforward thing where, oh, I know that if I enter this every time, I'm going to get this result. It takes a lot of kind of conversational back and forth to get the thing that you're looking for. And I think, I didn't want to get into necessarily the ethics and teaching and students using AI, but what it helps me to understand is that it's good if you know what you're looking for. I think with students who are still learning things, they don't know what they're necessarily looking for. And so it's a much harder tool for them to be able to discern what's quality and what's not. And I think for us, because we all have experience in teaching and in our fields, we have a better access to kind of knowing when the thing is useful and when it's doing harm. So just to say, so one of the things I first wanted to do, it's going to be a little tricky, but let's see. Okay, so here's what we're looking at. The window for ChatGPT that I use, I'm using a model called 4.0, but this work that we're doing is not really, you don't need the most comprehensive model. You just need to be able to upload a document. And so what I wanted to just show you is how I might go about generating kind of the bare bones of a rubric, starting with a project brief. So when I showed you the canvas, I showed you the kind of longish project brief with all the deliverables. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload that project brief into the field here. Hopefully it's still there, module 2. So I have the PDF of that. You could do a Word document, the PDF. I also have my settings in ChatGPT only stores things locally. So there's an option in the security features that prevents it from being uploaded to another place. I don't fully understand all of that, which is probably scary. And what I'm going to do is just use a prompt, very simple one, based on this PDF that says, what are the main learning objectives from this assignment? And using that prompt, it's going to read that project brief and determine what some of the main things are that students are learning from that project brief, which is super helpful. So I can take all of these different categories and begin to construct a rubric. It gives me a starting place, especially when I'm tired and I, don't aren't in the mood to really have to go through all the kind of languagey thinking that's involved in some of this work. And I have a great starting place to say, oh yeah, they did have to do collaboration on this project. I need to figure out a way to assess that. And so what it's doing here is it's telling me these different categories that may end up being learning objectives that I could assess and giving me a little bit of how it knows that those things are true. So they're being asked to work in small groups, they're engaged in discussions, right? All that's coming from the language that I uploaded from that assignment brief. Now I could very simply then just use this prompt, which says from these objectives, create a rubric, which is, a very simple prompt. The more detailed your prompt, the more specific you get. For instance, you could do this same exact exercise and get a different output. For instance, I'm not crazy about all of this 20 points, 15 points, right? Like it's making some assumptions about the weight. I didn't ask it to do that. So that's where our ability to discern and make choices comes into play. But you could also then be more specific in your prompt and say, I want a rubric based on a 5-point scale where 5 is excellent, 1 is unsatisfactory, and weight each criteria based on these factors, right? So you can be as specific as you want, but the nice thing here is it gives you language to start from for each one of these categories, right? So I don't even know, it's 3 reputable sources sounds like something I remember writing in the brief. So it is pulling some of this information from what I uploaded into there, which is really helpful as well. So you can see how you can, once you edit this to your own sort of version and language, you can easily transfer this into those Canvas rubrics or create a rubric using Google Sheets or Excel, if that's your preference. So yeah, so that's a kind of very simple one. So what I wanted to do was, what I wanted to try, and this is in the spirit of some of our recent assessment efforts, was to think about learning outcomes for the class and to think about assignment, how you can attach learning outcomes from the class to the assignment and the rubric, which I think is a good sort of mechanism to begin to have evidence to support some of our assessment efforts. So what I'm going to do here is kind of start over again. Let me reshare. Okay. So I'm just going to start fresh. And sometimes I'll do that just because you never know what gets, the way I have ChatGPT set up, it starts to learn about me, which means that it knows what I do, it knows my role and things like that. So it begins to sort of start to answer questions in that way. And if I'm just adding and building into this same chat, it's going to take what's already here and sort of continue to add to it. I found, and this may be just anecdotal, I may be using things incorrectly, but I found when it involves a document, it starts to not look at the document anymore, and it only looks at the stuff from above. I don't know if that's true or not. That's the sense I get. So sometimes I like to just start fresh, and I'm going to upload that document again. It's the same project brief. So, and then what I want to do is I have a prompt here that says align the course learning outcomes below with the assignment. Identify the main learning objectives for the assignment based on the course learning outcomes. So these are the learning outcomes that I grabbed from the syllabus. So this is for the entire course, not for the individual assignment. And what I want to see is how well connected can the learning objectives for this assignment be connected to those learning outcomes for the course itself. And of course we could, and so I'm just copy clipping all that from my Google document into the window. And we could see then how you could continue to extrapolate that out, right? You could say, what about the program learning outcomes? What about the school mission and vision, right? Like there's no end to how we can continue to connect those different ideas. So what it's doing here is it's looking through my learning outcomes, understand engaging with social, talks about how students have to integrate mental health challenges on campus. Anyway, it's basically trying to combine the learning outcomes for the class with the learning objectives for this particular assignment. It's a lot of words, and that's great. I could tell it to make it shorter. I could tell it to just bottom line what are the main sort of things, and that's actually what it's done for me here. It must be learning me, because at the end it's saying the main learning objectives for the assignment based on course learning outcomes are the following things. I may not agree with these and I may have to go back through and edit them. That's fine. But again, it's giving you this like not starting from zero, because the starting from zero is the thing that can be the most draining and challenging when we're doing this type of work. Just to follow up with this, I'm going to add in another prompt, which will then now design a single rubric based on these learning objectives on a 1.5 scale, blah, 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 blah. Suggest a weight for each criteria. And using the objectives that it decided were good based on my, so this is interesting. It's doing a different sort of setup here. No, I guess not. It gave us a little graphic up at the top. I have no idea why sometimes it decides to do things like that and sometimes it doesn't. If we don't like the way that it's answering some of these questions here, we can always ask it to make them more detailed. We can edit them, of course, ourselves, which is the best option to add in our own language. But basically, it's a great start to sort of think about how we can align a project to the larger program or the learning outcomes for the class, which is something I think is not always explicit for students and not always explicit in our course materials. I think, we have a syllabus, it has those learning outcomes. How great would it be at the top of an assignment brief to indicate the learning outcomes that that assignment's connected to? Those things help students understand the scaffolding within the class, but also the larger arc of their learning across their curriculum that they might be in. I've got some more complex examples, but I'm going to stop here for a second because hopefully there's some challenges, questions, etc. Yes, Sophia mentioned about the math part of rubrics, and indeed, same. I think that's one of the things I found it to be really useful for equations in sheets and equations I use Notion a lot, which is just another, you know, database tool. And I don't know how to do all that coding, but I can just tell it what I want it to do, and it gives me the code to enter in. And the other thing I would say is, even for a faculty member who has never used a rubric before in their classes, which I'm sure there are some, just saying step by step, tell me how I should go about writing a rubric for my class or my assignment. And it will at least give you some guidelines, like first do this, then do this. I actually did that when I was kind of messing around this week just to think about how we could talk about this here. And that is like, what would I even start to talk about? What would be the first thing I would do? How would I use AI for a rubric? It's become kind of intuitive for my process now, but if I'd never done it before, just ask it. It'll give you some ideas. And always, if you always say step by step, it'll give you step-by-step things to follow. The other prompt that I find that's particularly useful is to have it ask me questions. So for instance, if I'm trying to maybe write a rubric based on a project brief, say I want to, upload the project brief. I want to write a rubric for this brief. Ask me 5 questions to help clarify what the rubric should look like. And it'll ask you questions, you answer them one at a time, and then it will respond more catered to you. So if you don't even know how to write the prompt, ask it to help you to write the prompt. I think some people assume they have to know how to do it all at once, but just playing a little bit naive is sometimes helpful to question your own process as well. Do you think there's a useful number to the yes. And do you think there's assignment that do not benefit from a boot? So I want to, yeah, more conceptually talking about kind of rubrics, I think is what this opens up, Jennifer, and a couple of things. So you saw the weighted rubric that I shared. That was the Google Sheet that had the 25%. I'm also a big fan of self-assessment. So for students to have to kind of evaluate their own work, what I will do, I've done it in a variety of ways. One is to give them the full rubric that I've designed, and then they use that to sort of grade themselves. But once, especially in my creative projects, and as students get more mature in their curriculum, they have independent interests that are still within the boundaries of the course learning outcomes, but might be a little different than other students. They want to explore using a particular tool, and this may take away from their ability to spend time on something else, right? What I will then sometimes do is give them the opportunity to change the weights. Maybe I'll say, it has to add up to 100, but whatever you want to do over here is up to you. So if presentation is the thing you really want to work on because you're excited about getting a job and you want to put that at 30%, or talk about it's a conversation, but that gives them a chance to have some ownership and some flexibility there. And the other thing I've done is I'll give them a set of maybe 3 criteria and then ask them to write the last one. So something that they want to be evaluated on for themselves, for their peers, and for me. And so I think in terms of the number, it's tricky because initially when I was writing rubrics where I wasn't using the 5 through 1 system with a description of what 5 means, what 4 means, what 3 means, I was kind of writing each thing myself for each student, and it would take days. And so the less was better. But if it's a complex assignment that's, a midterm for a big project, I think you might need a few criteria. The challenge is that it starts to diminish the value of each one of those things. So I think it's a matter of balancing what's important and what's not. Having a bunch of things with like 5%, it's not going to make much of a difference in a student's grade. So I think there is some, because once you have the thing done, it's a lot faster to actually do the grading. It's this, it's that, and they kind of understand what that means. Of course, there's notes and things on the bottom, and do you think there's assignment that do not benefit from a rubric? I guess so, yeah. What do you think is an example of that? Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think it depends on different phases of the class and the different phase of the project. For example, I think, students doing peer review is a good example. They may not, they may have something to kind of guide them because I think sometimes they'll get too unwieldy with the different comments and things. But that could be post-it notes, that could be just conversation. I mean, in the classes I teach, there's enough opportunity for informal feedback in low stakes projects, things that we do that are sort of fun, and those don't have rubrics attached to them. The flip side of that is almost the more prescriptive, and that is, we'll have a very technical assignment. So in architecture and interior design specifically, students may have to think about codes and life safety requirements of different spaces, and there's just right and wrong answers to that. And so for that, it's almost more of like a contract grading model where it's either it's there or it's not. And that's a little bit more prescriptive almost than these types of rubrics. Um, and yeah, I could imagine if you're helping the kind of metacognition, Rita, if you're helping students try and learn how they learn, and there's not necessarily a rubric provided, there's nothing stopping them from taking the assignment and saying, how might I be graded on this? Right? Like, what are the things that I should be sort of focusing on? Which is kind of an interesting way of empowering them to think about it. And then it undermines the whole need to do the whole thing in the first place, right? Like if they're learning what they need to learn. So I have this like more complex one just to show you how it can get really wild if it's not already. Um, so I will just maybe share with you what the prompts are that I came up with for this. And again, it's always weird because it's going to look a little different for everyone. Um, but so I just kind of created a document that has some prompts on it and just shared it in the chat. And this assumption here is that if you look at the kind of first area that says primary prompt, and I'll share my screen too, just so that um, I noticed I titled this document "One Possible Process" because I think there's endless, and it all has to be catered to your own how you're doing that. So in this case, you would identify those core competencies for the assignment. And then, the prompt is very simply, I need to create a grading assignment for assignment X. The rubric should include the following criteria. Those are those core competencies. Use this 5-point scale, provide clear descriptions, blah, 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 blah. So what I did here is I just kind of gave it a little bit more detail. So making some assumptions about this. And I will just copy this. Oh, I guess the example is down here. Yeah. So I'll just copy this into the chat GPT right now. And I think I need to reshare. Let's see. Okay. So, and if you use Claude or, I mean, any of those work. Oops, so copy that. I think I just, in the interest of it not making a total mess. So in this one, I've just kind of answered those questions, like the criteria are concept development, creativity, design execution, functionality, blah, 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 blah. And it automatically sort of gives me this thing. And I asked it to be a table for easy use in Google Sheets, right? So just to kind of skip all the interim steps, I did go ahead and format that into Google Sheets to show you what it could potentially look like. And I can also share this with you so that you can see. Oh boy, where did the chat go? Where does it go when you're in this? Ah, okay. All right, so just to kind of give a sense of, this needs love for sure. It needs more explicit information for each one of these things, but everything that's in here, including even the calculation for this grade, all came from that one prompt. So, it doesn't have to be this complex, but it just goes to show that, you can get all of the kind of technical information that you need in order to generate something that is really quite, detailed and gives you a lot of specifics. We have the weights for each one of those things. It does start to give you some criteria that you may want to make more detailed and add things to. So, and of course, the new Google Sheets is also quite nice in how it creates these tables and makes the formatting all pretty. So yeah, and then what I would do in the case of for my own classes, if I'm not using the Canvas rubrics, I would just create a separate tab for each student and then grade them by entering in how they did. I would also most likely add a field for comments down here where I'd give them some feedback. And then you can export these as separate PDFs and attach it to their assignment on Canvas or hand it out to them, whatever works best for you. Another tool, just as a Canvas note, because I'm all about trying to make this as much information as possible for the student with as little additional effort for me as an instructor. Like I really want, to be able to spend the time giving them the kind of face-to-face, in-person feedback and experience that they should be having. And I find that the notes in Canvas audio recording, it's a plus because it's much faster, I find, to just record myself talking than it is to write in a way that sounds articulate. Although I'm not saying that I sound articulate when I talk, because that's not true either, but it's more human. And if they want to, they can transcribe it, which is also really great. And if they have a challenge with English, they can transcribe it into their native language as well. So there's all sorts of valuable assets that are here in this new world. I'm looking at the chat. Do you think you use AI to create a rubric from the course learning outcomes and ask it to write an assignment? Ooh, that would be fun. Yes. And I mean, anything. Like, it's very, we ran a competition recently for an external project, and, we knew what we wanted the student groups to present as part of the competition entry. But, doing all of the work of kind of identifying the step-by-step thing, we just inserted, what our outcomes were, give us an outline for how we could frame this as a competition brief, and it was pretty good. So it was very helpful in doing that. Yeah, sometimes that's one thing that that I kind of is not always the best, and that is, for instance, when I created the Google Sheet version of the ChatGPT one that you saw, the table, all of the equations it gave me were off by one cell. because of how I entered it in. So I had to go in and change it from J3 or whatever to I3, right? There's some weird things like that. Um, I think it's helpful to be as specific as possible. And yes, as Jennifer says, like I always write too much in the chat, for sure. And there's not really a need to be polite, even though it feels wrong to be demanding. But this is like a moment where you can lean into your like authoritarian instincts and demand that it does it. Oh, Zoom chat. Well, that too. I was thinking about the chat box in the AI, but no, Zoom chat, don't be authoritarian. I don't think that's healthy. But with ChatGPT, for sure, it needs to be told what to do. For instance, we did an exercise recently. I think I was telling Jennifer this yesterday in our SLC meeting, but we had asked, it was one of those things where, and this is another place where if you're, this is not a rubric related content, but if you're trying to think of exciting and new in-class exercises, and one of our faculty wanted to do a thing where there was different learning stations in the class. There's 12 students, 4 stations, and he wanted each student to experience each station, but not with the same people. That's some like trigonometry or something. I don't know how to do the equation to figure out how to not repeat the same person in the same. So we asked it to create that. And in order to make it more simple, so as opposed to saying like A, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the numbers represent the students, and right, we said, why don't you tell us a theme for each table and give us names for the students? Well, I'll tell you about the names for the students. They were Ashley, Jason, Christopher, Brian, right? Like they were the most Americanized white names that you could imagine. And I got mad at it. I told it, I said, you cannot do that. You need to give us names that represent the diversity of our institution, international students, and all this kind of stuff. It did then come back with names that were more appropriate, but it just goes to show, like, if you're not thinking in that way, there's real issues that can emerge. So it's always about kind of like I know enough about Excel to know that I need to change the numbers from J to I. I know what it looks like to see a list of white names for students, right? Like those things, if you're not thinking about that, then it's a potentially really damaging thing to use.
Do you think you could actually, I see we have like 2 minutes left.
Mhm.
So if anyone else has questions, please interrupt me. But I wonder, thinking of the bias that can come up, do you think you could ask it to tell you what biases you should ask it to look out for?
I haven't tried that, but I could imagine. I think it could be really interesting, to take a course like a syllabus or to take readings that you have selected and ask those questions might be super interesting. Um, I found a lot, I do find that the more I engage and have those kind of sounds so weird, have those kind of conversations with it, the more I can tweak it to not be as biased as it tends to want to be initially. But yeah, you can give it a shot.
Right. For what it's worth, I've noticed too that Claude tends to be a little less biased.
Hmm, that's
Right.
interesting.